moment Carter Ashbourne stood up at the head of Ashbourne Group's quarterly board meeting and said what he said, every senior executive in that room went completely still. He was not supposed to be standing beside her. She was not supposed to be there at all. 3 hours earlier, 2 board members had called separately to suggest, very politely, that it would be wise to ask her to leave before the meeting began. Carter had listened to both of them. He had thanked them, and then he had walked down the hall and held the door open for Maeve himself. She was not wearing anything impressive. A dark blazer she'd had for 6 years, black trousers, flat shoes, no jewelry except the small silver ring her father had given her on her 30th birthday. Her hair was pulled back the way she always wore it when she was working, and she was, even standing in that boardroom, thinking about work, about the numbers she had pulled, the documents she had found, the truth she had spent 3 weeks quietly assembling. Carter looked around the room, then he looked at her. "Her name is Maeve Donnelly," he said. "She came here as a temporary hire to help organize our legacy financial files. She did not come to take anything from this company. She came to give us something we had lost, the truth." Nobody spoke. At the far end of the table, Claudia Wentworth looked at the surface of the mahogany table and did not look up. "The person who has been lying to this company," Carter continued, his voice very steady, "is not in this room for the first time today. She has been here for years." How Maeve Donnelly came to be standing in that room on that Tuesday morning in late October is not a simple story. It is the kind of story that begins long before anyone realizes it has started. If you love stories about people who are underestimated, overlooked, and quietly unbreakable, stay with this one until the end. It is worth it. And if you are new here, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. 3 months earlier, Maeve was not thinking about Ashbourne Group or Carter Ashbourne or any boardroom. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Mississauga, reading a work email a second time, hoping it said something different than it had the first time. It did not. Her firm, a mid-sized financial consultancy where she had spent 9 years building expertise in forensic accounting, had dissolved, not dramatically, just quietly, the way things end when a managing partner retires and 2 others follow and the remaining clients scatter. There was a severance package. There was a letter of reference that used words like diligent and thorough. And there was Maeve, 34 years old, with a lease on a Mississauga apartment and a professional reputation nobody outside the industry had heard of. She took the Ashbourne contract because the timing was right and the pay was decent. 6 weeks, temporary, no possibility of extension. Organize and cross-reference the company's paper financial records from the past 3 decades. Scan, digitize, flag anomalies. The kind of work that sounds tedious but that Maeve had always found oddly calming. The way old numbers told stories that people had forgotten or buried. She was not prepared for the house. The Ashbourne family estate sat on 140 acres in the Muskoka region, 2 hours north of Toronto. The main house was the kind of place people described as heritage, stone and dark timber built in the 1930s, added to over the decades, but never in a way that felt wrong. There were gardens that had been tended so long they looked like they had simply always existed. There was a dock and a lake and a boathouse older than most of the people in the nearest town. Dorothy Ashbourne, who had run Ashbourne Group for 30 years before handing the reins to her son, still lived there. She was 71, elegant in the particular way of women who have never needed anyone's approval, and she interviewed Maeve herself on the first morning. "What do you expect to find in 30 years of records?" Dorothy asked. Maeve considered the question honestly. "Whatever is actually there," she said. "I do not go looking for anything specific. I follow the numbers." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said. "Most people come here expecting to find treasure. The honest ones find problems. I prefer the honest ones." She was hired. The first person Maeve met after Dorothy was not Carter. It was Henry. Henry Ashbourne Collier was 8 years old. He was the son of Carter's younger sister, who had died in a car accident on the 400 2 years earlier, along with her husband. Since then, Henry had lived with Carter and Dorothy at the estate. He had a bedroom full of art supplies he used constantly, and a therapist he saw every Thursday, and a habit of sitting alone in the sunroom for long stretches of time, not drawing, just watching the lake. The staff had learned to leave him to it. Several had tried to engage him, gently and kindly, and Henry had simply turned his face away. He was not rude, he just was not there for them. On her second morning, Maeve arrived at the estate early. She had brought her own coffee, and she was looking for a quiet place to work through the first box of records. Before the house fully woke up, she found the sunroom. She did not realize Henry was already in it until she was sitting down. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Sorry," she said. "I did not mean to intrude. I can go somewhere else." Henry shook his head slightly. Not quite an invitation, just a not necessary. Maeve opened her first folder and started reading. The room was quiet. Henry went back to looking at the lake. After maybe 10 minutes without turning his head, he said, "That is a lot of papers." "It is," Maeve agreed. "What are they?" "Old records from when this company started." Henry was quiet again. Then, "Do they have mistakes in them?" Maeve thought about that. Probably. Most things do. Another silence. "Can you fix them?" "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes all you can do is show people what happened." Henry nodded slowly, as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer to a perfectly reasonable question. And then they sat together in the sunroom for another half hour, both of them quiet, both of them at peace with the quiet in a way that felt, to Maeve, like something rare. She was walking back to the records room when she passed Carter in the hallway. She knew who he was. She had looked him up before taking the contract, but in person he was slightly different from the photographs. Taller maybe, more tired around the eyes. He was wearing a suit without the jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a coffee mug in one hand and his phone in the other. And he had clearly already been working for hours, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. He stopped. He looked past her toward the sunroom. Was that Henry talking? "Yes," Maeve said. Carter looked at her properly for the first time. "What did he say?" "He asked if I could fix mistakes in old records." Something shifted in Carter's expression. Not much, but she caught it, like a door opened a centimeter, and then, carefully, was pushed nearly shut again. "He has not really talked since." He stopped. "He was quieter this morning than usual, I noticed." "He was fine," Maeve said. "We just sat together." Carter looked at her for a moment longer than was quite professional. Then he nodded once and moved past her down the hall, and Maeve told herself that meant nothing and went back to work. The days that followed had a particular texture. Maeve worked through the records methodically, starting from the oldest boxes and moving forward. She had lunch with Dorothy twice that first week, which surprised her. She had expected formality, maintained distance. Instead, Dorothy told her about the early years of the company, about the lake in winter, about the predecessor who had worked for the family for 4 decades. "You are not what I expected," Dorothy told her on the second lunch. "What did you expect?" Dorothy smiled. "Someone more interested in impressing me." Maeve laughed. "I am more interested in your 1997 fiscal year. The reporting format changed mid-year, and nobody left a note explaining why." Dorothy's smile did not change, but her eyes sharpened. "I remember that year," she said, and did not add anything else. Carter was the kind of person who was always somewhere between arriving and leaving. He ran a global property empire from a combination of the estate's main office and a Bay Street tower in Toronto, and when he was home, the staff worked carefully around him. Not because he was unkind, but because he held a great deal of weight, and clearly had for a long time. He was also, she noticed, someone who watched. She caught him watching her with Henry twice in the first 2 weeks. Once in the sunroom, once in the garden where she had started eating her lunch. And Henry had taken to sitting near her at those times. Not always talking, sometimes just present. And Carter would stand at the window or pass through the garden with work in his hand, and his eyes would go to his nephew, and something in his face would settle. The first time they had a real conversation, it was late. She was still in the records room at 7 in the evening, cross-referencing 2 ledgers, and he came in looking for a file she had already scanned. "You are still here," he said. The 2003 accounts do not match the 2003 audit report, she said. I want to understand why before I move forward. He looked at the open ledgers on her desk. It is probably just a formatting issue. Probably, she agreed, but I do not assume. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my father used to say that. He would look at a contract for hours when everyone else said it looked fine. A pause. He found problems that saved us twice. Maeve looked up from the ledger. He was careful. He was, Carter said, and then, as if he had said too much, he moved to the filing cabinet and found his document and left. But he came back 20 minutes later with a second coffee mug, set it on her desk without comment, and went to the corner table to work on his own things. They sat in the same room for 2 hours that way, working in parallel, not talking much, and it was one of the most comfortable evenings Maeve had spent in years. Claudia Wentworth arrived at the estate on a Thursday, unannounced but clearly expected. She drove a charcoal gray Range Rover, wore a camel coat, and moved through the front hall like someone who had decided long ago that it belonged to her and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Maeve saw her first in the corridor. It was the particular way Claudia looked at her, a fast, assessing glance, the way you look at a piece of furniture to determine whether it needs replacing. That told her everything. Who is she? Claudia asked one of the household staff, loudly enough for Maeve to hear. She is working with the financial records, the woman replied. A temp hire. A temp, Claudia repeated with a small smile and moved on. That evening, Maeve ate in the kitchen as she usually did. She was not eavesdropping. The house simply was not as large as it pretended to be in certain places. Claudia's voice carried from the dining room. She has been spending quite a bit of time with Henry. I only mention it because you do not really know anything about her background. A contractor you found through an agency. Carter's response was quiet. She could not make it out. I am not suggesting anything, Claudia continued. I am only saying that Henry is vulnerable. It is very easy for people to create an emotional connection where it suits them. Maeve set down her fork. She had heard variations of this her entire life. The version that said a woman without money was automatically suspect, that her care was automatically calculated, that the only reason someone without wealth would invest in a relationship with someone who had it was to extract something from them. She picked up her fork again and finished her dinner. The rumor started 3 days later. It moved through the staff the way rumors do in closed places, quickly and without a clear source. Someone had heard something about Maeve's previous firm. Not that it had simply dissolved, but that there had been a reason for it. An investigation, missing funds. Her name had come up. None of it was true, but none of that was the point. By the end of the day, 2 of the administrative staff would not meet her eyes in the hallway. Dorothy was quieter, over afternoon tea. And Carter, whom she passed on the way to the records room, looked at her with something careful and unreadable in his face that had not been there the day before. She found him in the records room that evening. You have heard, she said. It was not a question. I have, he said. None of it is true. I know that is not necessarily what you would say if it were. No, she said, it is not. She sat down across from him. My firm closed because 3 of the 4 partners retired within 18 months of each other. There was no investigation, there were no missing funds, my work history is clean, and I can provide 5 references who will confirm that. Carter looked at her steadily. Why are you telling me that so directly? Because I have spent my whole life having people assume the worst about me, based on where I come from and how much money I have. She kept her voice level. People assume that someone who needs money must want to take yours. It does not work that way. But I have never found an argument that changes someone's mind if they have already decided that is true. So I tell you the facts and you decide. Carter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My mother hired you after a 20-minute conversation. Dorothy Ashbourne has been wrong about people exactly once in her life. And she still talks about it 40 years later. I am not going to pretend I have had any reason to doubt you. Something loosened in Maeve's chest that she had not realized was tight. There is something else, she said. She had been carrying it for 2 weeks. My father was an accountant, she said. He worked for a company called Meridian Holdings. In 1998, Meridian Holdings was acquired by the precursor to Ashbourne Group, your father's first major acquisition. Carter went still. During the integration period, money went missing from the Meridian accounts, a significant amount. Someone inside the combined company had been moving funds. My father was the accountant with the most access. He was blamed. She kept her voice very even. He lost his job. He lost his license. He spent 3 years under investigation before charges were quietly dropped because there was never any real evidence. But his career was finished. He spent the rest of his life doing bookkeeping for small businesses in Brampton. He died when I was 28, believing that most people thought he was a thief. Carter did not look away. I did not come here for revenge, Maeve said. I did not even come here knowing I would find anything. I came because I needed work, but I recognized the company name, and I thought, maybe there is something in these old files. Maybe I could finally understand what happened to him. And have you found something? She opened the folder she had brought. Yes. The documents were old but clear. Bank transfer records, internal memos, signatures, a chain of movement that, once you knew to look for it, was not difficult to follow at all. Someone had moved money from the Meridian accounts over a period of 8 months, always in amounts just below the automatic review threshold, always on days when the regular audit schedule was disrupted, and the authorization signatures on the transfers were not her father's, not anywhere, not once. Carter was quiet for a very long time after she finished. Who signed them? He asked. She told him the name. Clifford Wentworth, Claudia's father. The next morning, Carter asked Albert Kincaid to come in. Albert was 73 years old and had been the estate caretaker for 31 years. He had been hired by Carter's father, and he was the kind of person who knew where everything was, had always known, and never talked about it unless asked. He came into the main sitting room with his cap in his hands and looked at the documents Maeve had laid out on the table. He stood there looking at them for a long time. Then he said quietly, I wondered if this day would come. He had kept his own records. He explained this without apology or drama. Howard Ashbourne, Carter's father, had asked him to years earlier when he had started to suspect something was wrong but could not prove it before his illness took him. Albert had a file. He had kept it in the boathouse in a waterproof box for 22 years. The file confirmed everything. Carter called Claudia that afternoon and asked her to come to the estate. He did not tell her why. She arrived dressed beautifully, assuming probably that this was a conversation of a different kind. She walked into the sitting room and saw Maeve. Then she saw the documents. Then she looked at Carter and the careful composure she had maintained for decades, finally, visibly cracked. You do not understand the context, Claudia said. Carter's voice was very quiet. Tell me the context, then. My father, the companies needed capital. There were ways of moving money it was a different time. He stole from the Meridian accounts and let a man take the blame for it, Carter said. Maeve's father, a man who had nothing to do with it. Nobody was charged, Claudia said. Nothing was ever. He lost everything, Maeve said. She did not raise her voice. He lost his license. He lost his reputation. He worked in an industry he loved, and he had to leave it because someone with more power decided he was a convenient explanation. That is not a technicality. Claudia looked at her, and for just a moment, the smoothness dropped away entirely. You cannot prove I knew, Claudia said. Carter placed a second folder on the table. The emails between you and your father from 2019 suggest otherwise. When you started pushing for the Wentworth-Ashbourne merger, he wrote to you about loose ends from the Meridian days. You wrote back that they were buried deep enough. A pause. Those are your words. The room went very quiet. The formal proceedings moved quickly. Gerald Wentworth was 71 and unwell, but that did not make what he had done any smaller. Within 6 weeks, both he and Claudia faced formal proceedings, him for the original fraud, her for conspiracy and obstruction. The evidence Albert had protected for 2 decades, combined with what Maeve had found, was more than enough. On the day the findings were presented to the full Ashbourne Group board, Carter stood at the head of the table and held the door open for Maeve, and she walked in beside him. He said what he said. The board was silent. And then Dorothy Ashbourne, who was sitting 3 chairs and who had not been required to attend, but had come anyway, looked around the room and said, with the particular finality of someone who has built a company from almost nothing, "I think we all understand now. Shall we get on with it?" They got on with it. The formal restoration of her father's professional record was a document 2 pages long and absolutely devastating in its plainness. It said that the findings against Robert Donnelly had been based on falsified evidence. It said that all records of the investigation would be corrected accordingly. It said that Ashbourne Group expressed its regret for the harm caused. It said his name. Maeve read it 3 times in the records room, alone, before she allowed herself to cry. She had thought about this moment for so long, not with any real belief it would come, more the way you carry a quiet ache alongside everything else, that when it arrived, it felt too large to hold at once. She thought about her father in his small office on the 2nd floor of their Brampton house, doing books for restaurants and dental offices, being meticulous and honest and careful about every single number, exactly as he had always been. She thought about him telling her, near the end, "I know what happened. I know the truth. I just wish someone else did too." Someone else knew now. She was still in the records room, late in the evening, when Carter found her. He sat across from her in the corner chair with the good light, the chair he had started sitting in weeks ago. "You should have gone home hours ago," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He was quiet for a while. Then, "I want you to know something. I know this started as a contract position. I know that is a strange way for all of this to happen, but the way things changed here, the way Henry started talking again, the way my mother mentions your name in every conversation we have." He stopped. He was not a man who fumbled for words often, and the fumbling was, quietly, devastating to witness. "None of that was because of what you found." Maeve looked at him. "It was because of who you are," he said, "before the documents, before any of it." She thought about all the times she had sat in a room and felt herself being sized up, not for her skills, but for her address, her clothes, the name on her father's firm before it was taken from him. She thought about what it cost, year after year, to keep walking straight anyway. "Carter," she said. He looked at her. "I did not come here expecting anything except 6 weeks of work," she said. "But I think this place feels more like somewhere I belong than anywhere has in a very long time." He crossed the room. He took her hand in both of his. It was the kind of gesture that was not about romance exactly. It was about recognition, the kind that goes straight through the surface of things and finds what is underneath. "You do belong here," he said. "I would very much like it if you would stay." She stayed. The winter at Muskoka was extraordinary. The kind of cold that is also, somehow, warm when you are inside, looking at it through the right window with the right people around you. Henry started drawing scenes from his days instead of just watching the lake. Dorothy taught Maeve how to make the specific shortbread she made every Christmas, from a recipe handwritten on a card from 1967. Carter came home earlier. The proposal happened in March in the records room, which was not romantic in any conventional sense, but it was where they had first really talked, and it was where her father's name had been spoken back into the world. And Carter came and found her there one evening with a question that had clearly been sitting with him for some time. Henry asked to be the ring bearer. He was extremely serious about this responsibility and took it very seriously, which made Dorothy laugh for 10 minutes straight. The wedding was small. It was at the estate in late June, when the gardens were at their fullest, and the lake was the particular blue-green color it turned in the long evenings. Maeve wore a dress that was simple and exactly right. Carter cried, which he had not anticipated, and which Henry found tremendously interesting. A year and a half later, their daughter was born on a Tuesday morning. Carter held her with the expression of a person suddenly in the presence of something that recalibrates everything he thought he understood. Dorothy sat beside the bed. Henry stood in the doorway in his school uniform because nobody had thought to call the school, but he had come home on his own anyway because he had known. She looks like she is figuring things out already, Henry said, studying the baby very seriously. Maeve said, she takes after her grandfather. Dorothy reached over and took Maeve's hand and held it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Outside, the Muskoka autumn was turning the hillsides gold and red, and the kind of amber that only happens in Ontario in October, when the light comes through at an angle that makes even ordinary things look important. The lake was very still. And in that old stone house, in a room that had held so many years of quiet, there was a sound that had been missing for a long time, and was now simply back.